Did you think learning Italian would be easy? Well, I did. I learned Italian in my 20s, moved to Rome, worked in an Italian company, and passed my C1 exam. But I struggled for years. I was tongue-tied, I felt self-conscious speaking, and frustrated when I forgot things. So to help you learn Italian 10 times faster, here are 21 hard-earned lessons that I wish I'd known sooner, so you can avoid my mistakes and speak Italian with real confidence. Lesson 1. Now, I thought group classes would help me speak Italian, but they did the opposite. In all my group classes, I spent about 70 to 80% of the lesson frantically jotting down what the teacher wrote on the board. Now, most of the class was theory. There was very little time to actually use what we were learning. So when it came time to speak, I froze, not just because I was nervous, but because I hadn't practiced. Now, I understood the rules, but my speaking skills weren't evenly developed. So lesson number 1 is understanding Italian and speaking Italian are two completely different skills. Input helps, it builds knowledge, but output and actually speaking are what create confidence. Now, confidence leads to motivation, and motivation is what keeps you going. Speaking practice doesn't need to be intense or perfect. It just needs to be regular and low pressure. So start by chatting with people that you don't feel self-conscious around or judged by. For me, that meant talking to people who didn't speak any English at all. The stakes felt lower and the pressure disappeared. Making mistakes when speaking isn't something to avoid, it's something you have to pass through. It's not a dead end. As Italians say, sbagliando si impara. You learn by making mistakes. Lesson number 2. Now, in the early stages of learning Italian, I thought that textbooks were the only way to go. My bookshelves, like this one, were filled with Italian textbooks. But they had one major flaw. They all started out teaching things I couldn't use straight away. My goal was to speak to my dad in Italian, not to recite to him the alphabet or list off names of colors or kitchen utensils or even items around the house. I wasted years following someone else's idea of how Italian should be learned. It wasn't practical and it definitely wasn't goal-based. I remember thinking, why can't I read a few pages and walk away with something that I can actually use today? So lesson number 2 is, don't use textbooks. At least don't follow their order of learning things. They aren't a novel you read cover to cover. Treat them like a dictionary, looking up grammar and vocabulary that you need when you need them, and skip the rest. Instead, start with your goals and work backwards. Learn only the grammar and vocabulary that helps you communicate what you want to say. Now, that realization is what led me to create my 80-20 method, where the focus is on the top 20% of the language that you'll use 80% of the time. Now, this is what gets you speaking from day one. Now, to find out more about my method, you can download my free ebook, How to Learn Italian So Fast That It Feels Like Cheating. Each chapter includes practical tips, real-world examples, vocabulary hacks, and memory tricks. Now, I wish I had known all this stuff sooner. To get your copy, just click on the link in the description below this video. Okay, lesson number 3. Now, when I first decided to learn Italian back in the early 2000s, I thought that group classes were the best option. So every Wednesday at 6 p.m. I showed up, tired from the day at work or at university, and excited to learn. But I sat there for the first 30 minutes of the 60-minute lesson, just trying to remember what we covered in the previous week's lesson. To try and fix that, I joined another group class at a different school, just to keep my Italian fresh. But the problem I noticed with all group classes was that every student was at a different level, even though we were all supposed to be at the same level. Some students were way ahead and made me feel stupid. Others hadn't even done the work and they slowed the whole class down. So lesson number 3 is, group classes are great for socializing and hiding in the corner if you're shy, but don't expect quicker or better results from them. Having one class a week isn't regular enough, and they aren't an effective use of your time, especially if you struggle to find time to learn. More on that later. I only really started to speed up my progress once I added one-to-one lessons with an Italian colleague I had at the time from Milano. Shout out to Sebastiano. Okay, lesson number 4. Now, because I didn't get much speaking practice in group class, for the longest time, I avoided speaking Italian. I was sure people would judge me for making mistakes or laugh at my accent, and looking back, most of that fear came from my ego. I was worried about sounding stupid, about choosing the wrong tense, about not sounding Italian enough with my Italian heritage. Now, the first time I met my friend Silvia at a mutual friend's party, I was nervous to speak to someone new and painfully aware of my accent. So I told her straight off the bat that I was still learning, and she surprised me. She complimented how well I spoke. You know, that warm, heartfelt kind of praise that makes you beam with joy? She wasn't judging me like I thought. She only wanted to support me and offer gentle corrections when I needed them. So lesson number 4 is, no one is judging you more than you judge yourself. Clarity matters far more than sounding native. Confidence grows when you stop protecting your ego and allow yourself to be imperfect. Real progress starts the moment you stop trying to sound flawless and start focusing on being understood. Lesson number 5. Now, have you ever done something so many times that you could do it without thinking? Well, living in Italy meant constantly meeting new people, and I realized I was saying the same things again and again, introducing myself, explaining where I was from, talking about my dad immigrating to Australia, and regularly explaining to hotel staff why I wasn't a man at check-in, but an Australian with Italian heritage named after her nonno. This still happens, by the way. Now, because I repeated this same script so often, something interesting happened. I stopped thinking. I stopped worrying about the words that were coming out of my mouth. They came out automatically. My brain didn't freeze. I wasn't translating in my head anymore. And in those moments, I felt fluent. Not because my Italian was perfect, but because those phrases were fully automated. This is what I call fake fluency. So lesson number 5 is, confidence doesn't come from courage. It comes from familiarity. Here's a shortcut to use. Create small everyday scripts and repeat them until they become automatic. Start with introducing yourself, saying where you're from, making small talk, explaining the same personal details that you share with everyone. This fake fluency does 3 powerful things. It builds speaking confidence quickly. It frees up mental space to say new things, and it keeps conversations moving without awkward pauses. You'll know you're doing this right when you start to feel like a robot, repeating the same lines to everyone. Lesson number 6. Have you ever felt frustrated for forgetting an Italian word or a grammar rule? Well, I did, constantly. I'd beat myself up, spiral into thinking I was dumb, and convince myself that I'd never learn Italian. Years later, I finally understood why. I learned about the forgetting curve, which is based on research by Hermann Ebbinghaus. Now, his research showed that within the first hour of learning something new, we forget around 50% of it. After 1 week, we forget roughly 77%. How crazy is that? Now, that drop-off is called the forgetting curve, and this is exactly why group classes don't work, especially if you're only going once a week. No wonder I sat there at the beginning of each lesson trying to remember what I did last week. So lesson number 6 is spread out your learning. You don't need to cram in hours, you just need 10 minutes a day of focused attention. Progress comes from showing up a little and often, not cramming once a week. This boosts your memory, leading to far better long-term retention than marathon study sessions ever will. When I started learning this way, my brain stopped hitting the reset button all the time. I stopped relearning and I finally started making progress. It's for this reason that I've designed all my Intrepid Italian courses to have short, clear lessons that you can do anytime, anywhere. No 90-minute marathons and no burnout, just real daily momentum. Okay, lesson number 7. Now, before moving to Italy from Australia, I remember being in a taxi on my way to a meeting with my boss. Now, his second language was English, and although he already spoke it really well, he insisted on one rule. If he made a mistake, I had to correct him. So when he said yesterday night instead of last night, I corrected him. He thanked me and then said something I've never forgotten. He said that whenever he learned something new, he made a point of using it 2 to 3 times within the next 24 hours. Now, this was a light bulb moment for me because at the time, I'd already been learning Italian for about 2 years, and it struck me as such a simple yet powerful idea. So I tried it, and almost immediately I noticed a difference. My memory improved, and I stopped forgetting so much. Now, there's research that backs this up too. American educator Edgar Dale explained this with his cone of learning. Now, after 2 weeks, we remember roughly 10% of what we read, 20% of what we hear, and 30% of what we see, 50% of what we hear and see, 70% of what we say, and get this, 90% of what we actively do. So lesson number 7 is, when you learn something new, use it immediately. Actively using what you learn helps you retain up to 90% after 2 weeks. In other words, use it or lose it. Or as the Italians say, la lingua va parlata. A language has to be spoken. Lesson number 8. Now, before smartphones, tablets, and Google Docs, I wrote all my Italian notes down by hand. Exercises, homework, everything was on paper. Looking back, I now know that not having those tools actually worked in my favor. Putting pen to paper played a huge role in how well I remembered Italian, because writing forces deeper processing. You slow down, you summarize ideas in your own words, and that effort strengthens memory. In fact, the Association of Psychological Science states that there is something about typing that leads to mindless processing. And there is something about ink and paper that prompts students to go beyond merely hearing and recording new information. Now, this links directly back to what we talked about earlier. We remember 90% of what we actively do after 2 weeks. So, lesson number 8 is always take notes with pen and paper. Avoid digital devices unless you're genuinely handwriting on a tablet. And there's also an added bonus. When your notes are so good, you often don't even need to go back to reread them. Lesson number 9. Now, the first year I lived in Italy, I traveled to Sicily to celebrate a friend's birthday. And at the time, my Italian was, pretty functional, but I wasn't fluent. Now, I could hold conversations, but I was still making mistakes and I definitely didn't feel confident. And the first night we arrived in Palermo, we ended up at a small local restaurant with no English menu and no English-speaking staff either. Shortly after sitting down, a woman at the table opposite us leaned over and asked me, "Di dove siete? Where are you from?" The moment I replied in Italian, her face lit up. Her name was Maria, and she was genuinely delighted that we had chosen her hometown to celebrate something so special like our friend's birthday. Later that evening, she stopped me again and took my arm and proudly introduced me to her family, and then invited myself and all my friends over to her home the next day for caffè e torta, basically afternoon tea. The following afternoon, we sat around her table eating 2 homemade cakes that she had baked herself just for us. We sat around chatting with our imperfect Italian, laughing, gesturing, and filling in the gaps the best that we could. So lesson number 9 is, you don't need to be fluent to connect with people. Italians don't care if you have an accent or you mix up your tenses. In fact, their eyes often light up when they see you making an effort to speak their language. Being hard on yourself only holds you back from forming real and unexpected connections with people. Now, trust me when I say that you'll cherish these connections more than visiting any monument or museum in Italy, as amazing as they all are. Lesson number 10. One night I was out with an Italian friend and we were talking about movies. I wanted to say the title of Pirates of the Caribbean, but I didn't know the word for pirates in Italian. So instead of switching to English, I described it using words I did know. I ended up saying something like, "Come si chiama quel film con gli uomini cattivi in barca?" Which loosely translates to, "What do you call that film with bad men in boats?" Now my friend laughed, then replied, "Pirati dei Caraibi." This was a new word that was unlocked for me, pirati. So lesson number 10 is, if you don't know a word in Italian, treat speaking Italian like a game of taboo. Use the words you already know to explain what you mean instead of switching to English. Every gap in your vocabulary is an opportunity to learn something new and keep the conversation flowing. Lesson number 11. Now, I remember when I first started learning the Italian past tense, the passato prossimo, and I remember thinking how strange it was that the literal translation for sono andato was I am gone, and sono tornato was I am come back, instead of it being I have gone or I have come back. Now, it was around this time that I watched the BBC series of Pride and Prejudice with my mum, when I realized something that changed the way I understood Italian grammar forever. And it's this: Italian is just like speaking English from the 1700s. Mr. Bennett said things like, "I'm glad you are come back, Lizzie," not "I'm glad you have come back."
I'm glad you'll come back, Lizzie. I'm glad you'll come back, Jane.
When I spotted this detail, the floodgates opened and I found even more examples like this, like how Jane Austen's characters would say pray, tell, which is exactly how Italians say it today with prego, mi dica. So lesson number 11 is, non-native teachers like me do have an unfair advantage of being able to spot similarities between the two languages and can create a bridge that makes it easier for students to cross and to get into the mindset of how Italian grammar works, making it easier to grasp and not feel completely foreign after all. Lesson number 12. Now, I'll be honest, this is something I still struggle with and have to actively remind myself not to do. It's comparing myself to others. I notice that every time I compare my progress to someone else's, my confidence drops and learning stops feeling enjoyable. As they say, comparison is the thief of joy. So lesson number 12 is, don't compare yourself to others, or at least catch yourself when you do. We all start at zero. We all have different goals, commitments, and schedules. Don't compare your first year of learning Italian while living in your home country where English is spoken with someone else's 5th year who moved to Italy. It's not an equal contest. Learning Italian should feel fun and enjoyable. Celebrate every win. And when something doesn't work, don't see it as a failure. See it as feedback, a sign showing you what to focus on next. Lesson number 13. Do you ever have days where your Italian just flows? Words come easily, a grammar rule finally clicks, and you think, yeah, I got this. Then the next day comes and everything falls apart. You're tongue-tied, you're not sure if you should use the passato prossimo or the imperfetto, and suddenly you feel like you've gone backwards. Lesson number 13 is, learning Italian is emotional, not just intellectual. One moment you're on a high, feeling confident and motivated. The next you're doubting yourself and wondering why you ever started. This swing is normal. Language learning is a roller coaster and a mindset challenge as much as a technical one. When you experience pain or the urge to quit, realize it's just a sign of growth and progress. If you push through this and keep going, you will gain a massive advantage because 99% of people quit when it gets tough. Lesson number 14. Now, after 3 years in Italy, I ran out of visa options, so I moved to London. And I felt like I had to learn a new language, which was a bit strange. People used words and expressions I'd never heard of before, even though English is my native language. They would say things like, I was sat or I was stood, instead of I was sitting or I was standing. They used fancy words like bespoke. They called pants trousers because pants means undies. So lesson number 14 is, fluency isn't a destination, it's a journey. You never finish learning a language, and that's not a problem. It's part of the joy. Learning should feel interesting and fun, not discouraging. Do you know every word in the English dictionary? No. Can you still speak and connect and live your life anyway? Yes. Italian is exactly the same way. Lesson number 15. Now, all the years that I attended those group classes in Melbourne, at the start of each term, attendance was super high, but by the end, there was just me and the same 2 other students who attended every lesson and kept progressing to the next level. Now, we all started because we wanted to speak Italian, but why did those other students stop attending? As the term progressed, the lessons became increasingly more advanced. Learning Italian wasn't as easy as they had thought, so they gave up. Remember what I said about 99% of people? So lesson number 15 is, the biggest factor in reaching fluency isn't how smart you are, it's how badly you want it. You have to feel passionately about speaking Italian and feel energized by the experience. If you hit a roadblock, don't let it stop you. Search high and low for the best resources, tools, and teachers to help you get through it. Italians say, volere è potere, which literally means to want is to be able, or willing is powerful. In other words, where there's a will, there's a way. Lesson number 16. Do you feel like you don't have enough time to learn Italian? When I started learning Italian, I had a full-time job. I spent 3 hours commuting every day. So you might say I didn't have much spare time, but I didn't use that as an excuse. As I said earlier, I wanted to learn Italian so badly that I did everything I could to make it happen. I made time. I made it a priority so I could make the time. So when friends wanted to go out, I'd insist on only going to Italian restaurants just so I could practice my Italian. Yeah, it was really fun to be around at that time. When the Italian Film Festival in Melbourne was on, which lasted 2 weeks once a year, I saw 2 movies after work, the 6 p.m. and 9 p.m. shows, and sometimes 3 shows on one day on a weekend. Now, I used the time driving to the train station to listen to Italian music. And then on the train, I'd read my notes and then read books in Italian. So lesson number 16 is, it doesn't matter where you live, it's how you live. Progress in Italian doesn't come from having more free time. It comes from making Italian part of your life. When something truly matters to you, you stop waiting for the perfect conditions and start weaving it into the time you already have. Small intentional choices add up. What you focus on grows, and when Italian becomes a priority rather than an afterthought, progress becomes inevitable. Lesson number 17. Have you ever caught yourself thinking, maybe I'm just too old to learn Italian? I did. I still remember how overwhelming my first Italian lesson was. My teacher was talking about verbs, subjects, and tenses, and I barely understood English grammar, let alone Italian grammar. Now, for decades, scientists believed the brain stopped changing after a certain point in life. We now know this isn't true. Your brain has neuroplasticity, which means that it can form new connections at any age. I know this isn't just theory because I learned Italian, and also one of my students, Manya from the UK, shared this with me. She said, completing the course proved that even a 70-year-old beginner can learn a new language. So lesson number 17 is, you're never too old to learn. Learning might feel different than it did at 20, but different doesn't mean harder or impossible. Find tools and resources that you actually enjoy using. And if something isn't working, don't blame yourself. Move on and find a better fit. Finding the right Italian teacher, tool, or course is a bit like dating. When it's right, it just clicks. Lesson number 18. When I first started learning Italian, there were so many words that I got mixed up and I couldn't remember them. Now here's a classic example. I always mixed up the Italian subject pronoun for he, which is lui, and she, which is lei. To me, they look similar and they sounded similar, so I kept swapping them and mixing them up. Now at the time, I was watching a lot of polyglots on YouTube, learning from their study habits and experiments. One of them shared a simple memory trick that I tried and have used ever since. The idea is simple. When learning a new word or concept, look for patterns, sounds, or associations and connect them to something you already know. These are called mnemonics. So I applied this to my Louis Lay problem. To me, Louis sounded like the French name Louis, and Lay sounded like the female name Leia. Now, to make sure I didn't mix up the gender, I imagined King Louis of France and Princess Leia from Star Wars, and that was it. I never mixed them up again. So lesson number 18 is, when something doesn't stick, don't force it. Create a memory shortcut using images, patterns, rhymes, or acronyms. We already do this in English. Think about Roy G. Biv to remember the colors of the rainbow, or the mnemonic I before E, except after C, to remember spelling. And then we have my very educated mother just served us nachos to remember the order of the planets. If it works in English, it works in Italian too. Lesson number 19. Do you ever watch Italian shows, listen to Italian music, or cover your house with post-its and feel like you understand most things? I did all of that, and for the longest time I thought that meant I was learning Italian. Problem was, I wasn't progressing nearly as fast as I could have been. What I realized far too late was this. There's a huge difference between passive learning and active learning. Passive learning is when you receive the language that someone else produces. You listen, you watch, you recognize words. Your brain is familiarizing itself, but it isn't working very hard. And that's the issue. Active learning is when your brain has to retrieve information. You form sentences, you test the grammar, you pull words out of your head instead of just recognizing them. Passive learning feels easy and comfortable. You can do it for hours. Active learning feels harder. It requires focus and effort. But that's where progress actually happens. So lesson number 19 is, don't just consume Italian, use it. La lingua va parlata, remember? If you watch a show in Italian or a podcast, sit down with a notepad, write down new words, expressions, or structures, interact with the language, and then put them into your own sentences. Remember what I said earlier about writing things down? This is exactly why it matters. And make sure you evenly practice all 4 core language skills: listening, reading, writing, and speaking. If one of them is underdeveloped, your Italian will feel stuck. Lesson number 20. Now, early on in my Italian language learning journey, I thought collecting more tenses meant progressing faster. So I was eager to learn things like the passato remoto, the remote past, far too early. But the truth is, I've never once used it, nor needed to use the passato remoto while speaking. I can read it and recognize it, but for my everyday life living in Rome, it simply never came up, unless I was on a guided tour and the guide would say it. So lesson number 20 is, you only need a small set of tenses to say a surprisingly large amount of things in Italian. About 80% of the time, I use the presente, passato prossimo, condizionale, congiuntivo presente, and the futuro semplice. Learning every tense too early creates the illusion of progress, but it doesn't help you speak. And that's why I teach using my 80-20 method, where we focus on that small percentage of the language that you actually need to use every day. That means that you can speak sooner and with more confidence without feeling all the overwhelm. And to find out more, you can download my free ebook, How to Learn Italian So Fast That It Feels Like Cheating. Each chapter includes practical tips, real-world examples, vocabulary hacks, and memory tricks. I wish I knew all this stuff a lot sooner. To get your copy, just click on the link in the description below this video. Lesson number 21. Now, if you really struggle to find time to learn Italian, then don't waste that precious bucket of time learning stuff that you'll never use. Lesson 21 is, focus on the 80-20 of what you actually need to achieve your goals, not some textbook or some teacher. Focus on the top 20% of words and vocabulary that you will actually need to use outside of the classroom. Is your goal to speak to your relatives? Then first learn how to have basic conversations by learning just 3 tenses: the present, past, and future, and the most used everyday verbs. If you just want to travel around Italy and speak to the locals, learn how to order food, ask for directions, make bookings, buy tickets, and make small talk. Moving to Italy for work? Then focus on learning vocabulary that's relevant to your industry and learn office jargon and terms like in allegato when you attach something to an email. Now, although all the lessons I've shared with you today are incredibly powerful, if you don't know how to structure your learning, then none of them are going to work. So watch this video here where I show you step by step how to learn Italian so fast that it feels like cheating. This is what I'd do if I had to learn Italian from scratch again.